up, you phonies? How's it going? Welcome to another Blender, or more like After Effects tutorial. In the last video I showed you how to make a scene like that, how you can shoot footage like this where your friend is lifting his arms, lifting a bunch of CG cars, and in today's video I'm going to show you how you can render that in Blender properly to set it up for compositing in After Effects. Because even if you do a great job in Blender, you still need to do final adjustments in compositing to get the best, the real good result, right? So let's work on that right now. So in Blender you can render out different passes, like for your image, for your direct light, indirect light, for your transmission, glossy, diffuse, and all those things separately. And it's definitely worth it if you have a very complex, important scene. But in my case, what I like to do is to render all my image and my shadows separately. So I have, in the end, I'm going to have two different layers. I can back composite in After Effects. And the way I'm going to do that, you go to your view layer properties. And then you have this whole list here. And the only thing we have to check is shadow catcher. Now when we go up to our compositing, we see under our render layers, we have our shadow catcher. So if we render our image and shadow catcher separately, then we're going to have separate layers. And the way we're going to do that is we're just going to delete our composite. No, we don't need that. We need a file output node. Okay? And we connect image with our image. But the problem is, how do we connect shadow catcher in here now? Because there is nothing for that. And for this, you just click on your file output node, go up to node on your upper right side, hit on properties, and here you can add another input. Now you can call it whatever you want. I just call mine shadow, and that created another input here. So now when we connect shadow catcher with shadow, now it's going to render out the shadow, our CG shadow, and our image separately. But one more thing, under properties we also have to select our base path, where we want to render it to. And make sure when you do that, wherever you want to render to, make sure it's not under temp. Have some kind of file set up, make a new folder, and inside this new folder import or render your files. Otherwise, if you just blast it on your desktop, your entire desktop is going to be full with images, because that's what we're doing here. We don't render a video, we render a image sequence. So when we have 288 frames, we're going to have 288 images we're going to put back together in After Effects after this is done. One more thing you want to make sure, under color, hit RGBA. That way we're going to have an alpha. If we don't click this one, we're not going to have a transparent background, and then we're screwed. So make sure RGBA, and also color depth 16. And now go under render animation, and then it's going to render your animation. Who would have thought? I just did that already, and in my case, my scene on my computer, it took 10 hours on a very high threshold to render. Probably because all those cars were very high poly. So keep that in mind when you make your Blender scenes, to keep the poly count as low as possible, especially when you have an old ass computer like I do. Other things you can do is to, when you render in cycles, you can use a noise threshold. Mine was on 1.0. Something good would be 0.01. That would be a good threshold that gives you a lot of information, and it's going to look good, but it's also going to render 100 times longer. So depending on your computer, play with this denoiser here. Okay, once it's rendered, you go to After Effects and you double click here on the left and get your original video footage. This here is mine. Now you can just right click it and make new comp from selection. Now you have a fresh composition that you can add your effects to. And for that, again, double click here on the left, find your render, and now you have all those images here. And the important ones is find one which says image in the beginning, make sure PNG sequence is selected, and hit import. Beautiful. Now when we look at this, this is just our 3D assets. with a transparent background. That's why it was important to select RGBA, because everything what is black right now is actually transparent. Now we're gonna double click again because we need to get in our shadows here. So just select one of them. It doesn't have to be the first one, at least in After Effects. I'm not sure how it is in other editing or compositing softwares, but you just select any one of them, select PNG sequence and import. Now, before we drag and drop those in here, we have to keep one thing in mind. If you import an image sequence into After Effects, your frame rate is going to be off. It's going to be 30 frames per second, like on default. But this is the actual frame rate we want, 23.976. So just select the original video, go under here, interpret footage, hold Ctrl+C to copy this number. Now go to your image, go back to interpret footage and paste the number so you have the exact same frame rate, and do the same thing on your shadow. If you don't do that, your entire tracking is not going to be set up properly. But if you do that, we go back to our original composition, drag and drop our shadow in here, and drag and drop our image in here on top of each other. The image should be on top. So if we turn off our shadow, we see that the shadow appears and disappears. Now, as you can see, my original video is bigger than the video I rendered, just because it was faster to render a smaller resolution. So I can just increase the scale here. Either you scale it up with the scale, so you just select both with Shift and hit S. That's going to bring up the scale. Turn it up to 200. That's going to bring up the scale to the proper scale. Or the fancy way, but the slower way, is go to right-click Effect, go to Distort, and under Detail Preserving Upscale, you can also turn up here, and it tries to simulate the losing pixels or the quality loss. It compensates for that. That is the better way to do that. But just because this is a tutorial, I'm not going to do that here. But use that and just scale this to 200, and whatever we did here, we invert, and you use this effect for both. Then you're going to have the better results. And then just copy this effect to your shadow, and that's going to look better. Or the happy medium is what you can, so you can use both. You just turn off this effect. You keep the effect on your layers, but while you're working on it, you just go with the first way, with the faster way, and before you hit render, you just turn those effects on, scale it back down in the actual scale, so for the actual render, which can take a little longer, but you're gonna have the full quality possible. Anyways, that's about that. If you have a fast computer, you would have rendered in full resolution anyway, so that wouldn't matter. But if you have a slow computer, such as myself, that's what you gotta do. Always find the workaround. So the main issue right now is that we don't see our background because of our shadow. If I turn off my shadow on and off, I can see that the shadow is a big gray wall. And we obviously don't want that. The easiest way to compensate for that is you go on mode and hit multiply. That's gonna make our shadow transparent the way it's supposed to be. Another way is also darken, but usually multiply works best for me. Now we have to adjust our CG shadow, like this shadow, that it looks like this shadow. Adjust our CG shadows that they're exactly looking like our real shadow. And for that, I'm going to right click, Effect, Color Correction. And there's different ways, different effects, but I'll just use curves for now. So let's make those shadows darker. Let's zoom in here. So I want this shadow to look exactly like this one. When I turn the effect on and off, I can see I'm getting closer. My shadow is still a little bluer, like the CG shadow is bluer than the real shadow. So I'm gonna turn down the blues a little. Now it's a little too green, so I'm gonna turn down the greens a little. And that looks closer. That's definitely better. Now I'm also gonna increase the whites a little. So when I turn on and off my entire layer, I try to not adjust any of this not shadow part, only the shadow itself. Great. Once you believe your shadows are adjusted properly, then we can work on our next issue, which is quite obvious. Our 3D elements are in front of my friend here, Aramis. And that's a tricky one. That's why it's important to have a good color difference between my main guy and the background, so I can rotoscope him out frame by frame. If I shot this with a green screen, I would not need to do that, but I didn't, so I need to do that separately. So the way I'm gonna do that, this here is my video layer. I'm gonna duplicate it. We can even rename it, call it rotoscope, and I'm gonna bring this layer on top of everything. That's gonna make everything else disappear. But now I can rotoscope him frame by frame for the entire shot. So I'm going to make sure that on the first frame, I'm going to select the rotor brush tool, double click, and now I have to draw an exact mask around my guy here, making sure I don't get any street in there until I have everything what I want to rotoscope, what I want to mask, surrounded. So After Effects itself can help me with that a little. So you see that the mask I'm drawing is kind of rough, but the software tries to analyze what I actually want to rotoscope and what not. So if I have a little too much here, like the background is here, I just hold Alt and I can negative draw. And I need to get more of the ear in. And do yourself the favor to work as exact as you can, because for every mistake you're gonna make, you're gonna pay for it later, because you're gonna see those imperfections. But this has to be as exact as possible. You don't want to have any errors here. And depending on the shot, that can take longer. Sometimes it's faster. In that particular case, because here the skin and the street is almost the same color, it's quite difficult. But that's why we also made sure that he is keeping his fingers together, because now rotoscoping hands is way easier. If those fingers were apart, I would need to do that separately, but he has his fingers together, so it's faster. The shoes are not super important, but let's have them too. The more data we have, the better. And you can see the shoes are very dark, the shadows are very dark. The software doesn't know what I want to rotoscope and what I don't want to rotoscope. That's why it's important to have different colors, wearing different colors than your background. That always makes this process way easier. If he was wearing pink shoes and the pink pants, that would have been very easy. So now when I believe I rotoscoped him well, I'm checking all the edges here if nothing is sticking out, like this part. And once I think it's good enough, oh, found something. Because if you're not exact and later on you want to fix mistakes, then you get very ugly jitter and you're gonna see it and it's gonna be not pretty. So make sure on the very first frame you're working on, do a good job. Great. And once I believe it's good enough, I'm gonna make my view a little bigger so I can see better. And now I just hit space and let it do its magic, and I hope through the entire thing is gonna be perfectly rotoscoped. Sometimes I need to adjust, so I'm looking at all those edges here that everything is gonna look fine. But usually, and especially now with the After Effects beta, it does a very good job rotoscoping all that. So we're gonna see in a second. Depending on your computer, this process can take longer or shorter. See, now he's moving his arms and the software knows exactly what I want to rotoscope, so it's magical. A few years back, I would need to adjust every single frame, but now a lot of that is happening automatic with After Effects AI. Sweet. Now we got the shot done. It's not a perfect rotoscope, I gotta say, but it's definitely close. Now when we look at the final composition, we see that all the CG cars are actually in the background. Now one more thing we can adjust is those edges. You see that they're like perfectly sharp, especially you can see it here. So you can adjust, and under the rotor brush effects, you can adjust the feather. I usually crank this to like 20. I shift the edge to like a little negative space. Contrast is fine, and reduce chatter maybe by like 20%. Chatter is basically how it's going back and forth. So you don't want to go too crazy on that. So 10-20% is usually enough. And now we have the cars behind him. So when we look at our effect, we can see everything is behind him. The car is flipping a little too fast. I should have adjusted the render faster, but it's fine. I'm gonna have a little camera shake here. I'm gonna show you later how to do that. But it's a pretty cool scene. So the next step is really we need to adjust the colors so everything matches a little better. And for that, I'm gonna start with my actual video first. So we shot it a little overexposed, so I'm gonna add an effect called, under the color correction, it's called Lumetri color. And under Lumetri color, I'm gonna adjust the contrast, the highlights, shadows, so it kind of looks a little better. The thing is, I'm gonna turn off my rotoscope layer for now, so I can adjust both in the same time. So I'm gonna try to make my footage look, let's say, normal. And it looks better. It was blown out before, now it looks a little more natural. I think this is good. Now I'm gonna copy paste the same effect on my rotoscope, so even when I turn it on, it looks a little more natural. Now I'm gonna adjust my cars separately. So that's the layer I'm working on right now, just the cars and my little plants here, of course. And I can do that in curves or in Lumetri color. It doesn't really matter. In Lumetri color, you definitely have more control over what you're doing. Curves is a little simpler because you only have one effect available, but it's really up to you which ones you prefer. So go under color correction and let's go with curves and see how we do there. So first I'm going to adjust the brightness of everything, try to adjust it so it looks the same. I'm looking at like this black, for example, and this black. I want it to be like the same kind of darkness, even though the material is a little different. But let's say the rubber here, so I adjust that. And the brights, like this bright, and let's say the white here of the car, I try to compare those and match those two colors. I'm gonna work on the red separately, so I can make them more red or less red, and the blues, the greens, until color-wise it matches. One more thing I like to do is when I adjust those scenes, I always add like a layer of film grain. I scale this up until it fills the frame, which is 300% in that case. Use the mode overlay. So now I add like a film grain to the entire footage, which is going to help to cover up our effects a little. So yeah, overall, it's a pretty cool scene. I think I'm going to refine this edge here a little more. Go on my rotoscope layer, reduce chatter a little less because we need all this, and maybe feather it a little more. Let's say 30%. Let's shift the edge a little more, -15. Okay, here you can see when you overdo the chatter and then the feather, that's what the result is going to be. So we definitely don't want that. So yeah, that's a little better. So since my guy here is rotoscoped, I can add even more effects like in post. Usually it's better to do that in AfterEffects, but if you want to add like a little smoke and dust on top of everything, that always helps to sell an effect, and I use Video Copilot for that. Action Essentials, dust elements. So let's use dust wave. Put that on everything, but underneath your noise, that's important. Scale this up. And then let's start it once the car hits. So we have a little smoke going on. I'm going to adjust the color so it looks more like the concrete. So for that, I'll just go to Effect, Color Grading or Color Correction, and just use a tint. That's going to make it black and white. And that's pretty cool. If you want to go one step further, you can track your footage again in AfterEffects and have the smoke actually move. I don't think it's going to be necessary. And we can add another one of those smoke waves right in front of our guy here. So for that, I'm going to use a powder hit 1, drag and drop, and that one I'm going to move underneath my rotoscope, make it bigger. So once the car hits the invisible wall, which is exactly this frame, I'm going to move this to the right time and right position. So now it looks like it's actually hitting like an invisible wall. Yeah, I'm not a fan how fast this car is flipping over, but maybe it makes sense, I don't know. But the problem with those Blender scenes is it was so big that I couldn't really watch it properly, so it's like a lot of guessing game. But yeah, And again, if you want to, I'll show you how real quick. You can track your footage in After Effects as well. And for that, you go under Tracker. If you don't have it down here, go in Window, make sure Tracker is enabled, and hit Track Camera. And make sure you have your actual video selected when you do that. Now the software is trying to track your video in a 3D space. That way you can implement 2D elements or assets in your 3D footage, which is very helpful if you want to enhance your Blender scenes, for example, or any kinds of scenes. When I do visual effects on a film, that's how I mostly track my footage. Sometimes I track manually, just like in Blender, I pick spots and I try to track them. But in that case, I'm tracking my video with the 3D tracker. It's also like a matter of luck. Sometimes it just won't track it because it just doesn't work. Then you have to do it manually, but in that case, I'm pretty confident it's going to work. And here you can see the percentage and how much time it's going to take. And once this is done, I'm going to show you how you can track your 2D elements we already have in here to certain positions in 3D space. Now our footage is tracked. Here we can see lots of trackers, which is great. So I'm going to just select one position here, hit right click, and create solid and camera. And this solid should be tracked to our environment now, which is awesome. The After Effects tracker is really great. Now this solid here, I'm going to use the position information. I just click on position and copy this and go under my dust asset and turn on 3D layer, because that has to be 3D. Then you paste it. Then I'm just going to adjust the height, because I don't want it to be on the ground. I want it to be in mid-air basically. Adjust the scale so it's reaching out of frame, so I have no ugly edges. So now when I scrub through it, I can see that it's actually moving like my 3D environment is moving. Pretty sick. I'm gonna do the same thing with my other layer. So I can delete my solid now. I don't need it anymore. So I go under my tracker and select the point where the other smoke asset, which is in front of my arm, is here, which is basically here, just further right up. I'm gonna make another solid. This one is red, but it doesn't really matter. And now I'm gonna go into the position of this, copy, go under my powder hit, make sure 3D environment or 3D layer is selected, and paste it. Now the position is exactly here. Now I can just adjust it to the position I actually want it to be, like right here. Scale it up, and now it's actually going to be moving the way everything else is moving. I can delete my little solid here, I don't need it anymore. And now everything is perfectly tracked and rotoscoped and color matched. And the very last thing I like to do, I like to add lens dirt on my entire shot, which brings my shot basically closer together, make a solid. I do it with Video Copilot's optical flares. If you don't have that, you can just go on Google and download lens dirt. I'll show you in a second what that looks like, but I'll just create my own. Clear all, yes, and under lens dirt I'm gonna make it dirty, the color a little more closer to what my environment looks like this. Hit OK. The position is gonna be, let's say, the center. The mode is gonna be screen. And now I have lens dirt on my entire scene. And make sure this layer is underneath your noise, your film grain. Now you can go an extra step and add a little flicker, and then it's going to turn on and off a little, just as if we had some reflections glaring into the lens, like from a car or so. And you can adjust the brightness a little so it's a little more subtle. And if you need to do final adjustments, like maybe the highlights of my car is a little too bright, nope, those are the greens. The highlights, you can turn them down a little until the scene looks real. And one last tip, sometimes it's helpful if you click on your video, hit T, and turn down the opacity just a few %. So those cars are technically a little invisible, a little transparent, but that way it takes the colors of the background a little more, so that can help you too. And on the very end, I make an adjustment layer on top of not everything on top of all my effects and videos. Underneath my lens dirt and film grain, I'm gonna have an adjustment layer, use another effect, color correction, lumetri color, and here I can just make basic adjustments to everything, and that's also gonna help to bring your footage closer together. Like any adjustment you make, just make it subtle. Like make a little, maybe a little vignette. It always helps. Under creative, you can add a little sharpness, maybe a little vibrance, decrease the saturation. Play around until you like your image. And now when you think you're done, remember what we did in the beginning? We increased the scale of our image and our shadow. We're gonna invert that, so we're gonna go back to 100. This scale also 100. You see it's small now, but we're gonna turn on the detail preserving upscale we made in the beginning on both layers, and that way in your final result your cars in the background should have more or less the same quality like your foreground. And once you hit render, this is the result. So guys, thank you so much for watching. If you have any questions about that, please let me know in the comments below. Make sure to check out the first video of this part, how I made this scene, because it is very cool and interesting how you can make those scenes yourself at home for free with free software. It's incredible what technology allows us these days. But anyways, thank you so much for watching, and see you in the next video. Toodaloo.